January 1945. Northwestern France. Le Havre. A woman is on her knees in the mud. Her uniform is torn. Her boots are cracked open at the soles. The wind off the English Channel cuts through her like a blade pulled from ice water. Around her, 39 other women stand in silence. German prisoners of war, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the concrete floor of a blown-out harbor warehouse. Some of them haven't eaten in 3 days, and every single one of them is waiting to be beaten. That is not an exaggeration. That is what they believed with total certainty, because that is what they had been told would happen. German propaganda had spent 4 years painting Allied soldiers as animals, rapists, butchers, monsters in clean uniforms. These women had watched cities burn. They had seen what war turns men into. And now they were kneeling on French soil, unarmed, defeated, and completely at the mercy of the enemy. 30 seconds later, something happened that none of them could explain for the rest of their lives. An American soldier walked through the door, and he was carrying blankets. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and deeply human moments from the past. Stories that most history books never told. What you are about to hear is not a story about a famous general or a decisive battle. It is not the story of a weapon that changed the war, or a strategy that broke an enemy's spine. It is something rarer than any of those things. It is the story of what happens when human decency refuses to die, even at the exact moment history gives it every reason to. Her name was Lyselle. She was 22 years old. Before the war, she had been a bakery clerk in Hamburg, the kind of young woman who wrapped bread in paper and said good morning to the same customers every day. She had never fired a weapon. She had never given an order. She had simply been caught in the collapse, a wave of retreating fronts and shattered logistics that swallowed millions of ordinary Germans in the final months of the war. By January 1945, Germany was disintegrating. The Eastern Front had caved in catastrophically. Soviet forces were pushing through Poland toward Berlin at a rate that made German commanders physically ill. In the West, the Allies had crushed the last German offensive at the Battle of the Bulge, a desperate gamble by Hitler that cost Germany over 100,000 men in 6 weeks and produced absolutely nothing. The war was not yet officially over, but to anyone willing to look clearly at the numbers, it had already been decided. That is the context that matters. Because the women captured near the French coast in January 1945 were not captured at the beginning of the war, when idealism still had oxygen. They were captured at the end, when both sides had already seen things no human being should ever see. The American soldiers guarding them had come through Normandy, through the hedgerows, through the frozen Ardennes forest. They had pulled bodies from tank hatches. They had watched boys die in the snow, calling for their mothers. These were not men who had any particular reason left to be gentle. And yet, Lyselle remembered the moment with almost impossible clarity for the rest of her life. She had been standing near the rear of the group when the warehouse door opened. She braced herself. Every muscle in her body contracted. She had heard the stories. Interrogation lamps, screaming interrogators, the particular cruelty reserved for female prisoners. Her neighbor in line whispered, "This is it." Another woman began to pray. Then the sound changed. Not boots on concrete in the sharp rhythm of authority. Something softer. A shuffling. The low murmur of English voices, calm, almost bored sounding. And then, the smell. Wool. Clean wool, faintly soapy, the smell of storage and warmth. A medic, no older than 25, walked directly to Lyselle and without a word, without a single word, placed a folded army blanket around her shoulders. His hands were shaking. She looked up into his face expecting hatred and found only exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that lives behind the eyes after years of seeing too much death. He was not performing mercy. He was not following orders to be kind. He was simply a human being standing in front of another human being, and the blanket was the only thing in the room that made sense to him. Lyselle's knees gave out. She sank to the floor without meaning to, clutching the blanket the way a person drowning clutches whatever surface their hand finds first. And across the warehouse, the sound began to spread, low at first, then breaking open like something under impossible pressure. Not screams. Tears. 39 women weeping simultaneously in a bombed-out French warehouse while American soldiers moved quietly among them distributing wool. The French interpreter, a man named René, stood near the doorway watching. He had seen this before. The specific, devastating moment when an enemy encounters mercy instead of punishment and has absolutely no framework to process it. He would later say that the sound that filled that warehouse was the most human thing he heard during 4 years of war. The medics had brought more than blankets. They had brought small stoves, already lit, heating water for tea and for washing frostbitten hands. They moved through the crowd with professional calm, checking for infection, for hypothermia, for the particular wounds that come not from weapons, but from weeks of winter exposure and near starvation. One of them, a sergeant from Ohio named Lewis, knelt beside a woman whose feet were so swollen with frostbite she could barely walk. He worked without speaking, his rough hands careful and slow. When he finished wrapping the bandage, he looked up and said simply, "There." Then he moved to the next woman. Lewis had fought through Normandy. He had been at the Siegfried Line. He had helped clear the aftermath of Malmedy. He had every psychological justification a human being could construct for walking into that warehouse with contempt. Instead, he ladled hot water into basins and pointed gently at the women's hands. Inside the warehouse, a radio crackled to life in the corner. A slow American ballad, something about going home. The women who understood no English closed their eyes anyway and let the sound move through them. Music requires no translation. It simply arrives. Erica, a former nurse standing beside Lacelle, whispered, "Why are they doing this?" No one had an answer. Because the question itself revealed the depth of what had been done to them. Years of systematic propaganda had made ordinary human decency incomprehensible. They had been trained to see these men as monsters, and the men had refused to cooperate with that description. The refusal was devastating in ways that no act of cruelty could have been. Punishment would have confirmed everything they believed. Kindness demolished it. By midnight, the snow outside had begun to fall again. It landed on the wreckage of the harbor, the burned-out trucks, the shattered cranes, the rusted hulls of ships sunk during the liberation. Inside, the women slept under army blankets on a concrete floor, and the medics sat near the stove with their coffee and their silence. Lewis looked across the room at the sleeping figures and said quietly to Renee, "These aren't the ones who built that hell. They're just what's left." Renee nodded. The war ends differently for everyone. The morning came pale and cautious through the broken windows. The women woke into the brief amnesia of sleep. For 3 or 4 seconds, before memory arrived, they did not know where they were. Then the sound of boots outside brought it back. Yet the silence that followed was strange. No shouting, no dogs. Only the low sound of an American field kitchen being assembled 40 meters away, and the smell, impossible, unbearable, of coffee and oatmeal drifting through the cold air. Lewis appeared in the doorway, cup in hand. He spoke to Renee. "Tell them breakfast is coming." The words translated into German and landed like stones into still water. For a long moment, no one moved. A woman near the wall began crying again. Not from fear this time, but from the specific agony of confusion that comes when the world behaves in a way your entire education has declared impossible. Lysel stepped forward first. She took her tray. She sat on the cold floor with the others, balancing it in her lap. The first taste of warm porridge was almost unbearably sweet. For months, she had eaten bread crusts and boiled turnips. Now even this simple food felt like an accusation against everything she had been promised Germany would achieve. Across the room, Lewis and Renee sat together. "They thought we'd beat them," Renee said. One of them whispered last night that she expected worse. Lewis looked at his hands, the same hands that had once loaded a rifle, that had once pulled a trigger, that were now handing spoons to the women of the enemy. "I don't blame them," he said. "After what we saw back east, the camps, the bodies, I didn't think I'd ever look at a German face again and not feel something that wanted to destroy it." He paused. "But these aren't the ones who built that. They're just what's left." The hours moved slowly. In the afternoon, the medics returned with buckets of warm water. "For washing," Renee said. The women hesitated, and the hesitation itself broke something in the watching Americans, because they understood what it meant. These women could not yet believe that warmth was not a trap. The medics set the buckets down. They placed towels beside them. Then they turned their backs and walked to the other side of the room. The gesture, silent, deliberate, respectful, demolished the last wall. One by one, the women washed their faces. The water turned brown and cold quickly, but the act felt sacred. Lacelle caught her reflection in a small mirror someone had placed on a crate. She barely recognized the face looking back. Hollow cheeks, cracked lips, eyes that had seen too much. But behind them, faint and stubborn, was something still present. She whispered to herself, "I am still here." That evening, a young American private with freckles glanced up at the women near the door and smiled. The awkward, apologetic smile of someone who doesn't quite know how to be in the same room as the people his country has been trying to kill. None of the women smiled back. But several of them felt something shift. Fear was beginning to lose its grip, and something more terrifying was beginning to take its place. The recognition of a shared humanity. Because that is what these medics had done. Not through speeches or gestures or declarations, but through the patient repetition of ordinary human care. A spoon offered, a bandage wrapped, a blanket placed, hot water in a basin, coffee at dawn, music on a broken radio. They had not asked the women to be grateful. They had not asked them to renounce anything or confess anything, or prove they deserved to be warm. They had simply treated them as people. And in January 1945, in a ruined French port city, after 6 years of a war built entirely on the systematic denial of other people's humanity, that was the most radical thing anyone could have done. Laisel lay awake that second night, staring at the ceiling beams while the others slept. She thought about the medic who had wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. She thought about his trembling hands. She thought about the propaganda posters she had seen in school, the ones showing Allied soldiers as beasts, as demons, as creatures without mercy or conscience. She thought about the faces of the men who had made those posters, the men who had stood at podiums in great lit halls and promised Germany 1,000 years of glory. She thought about what was left of that glory. And then she said something into the dark, a single German word. Danke. Thank you. Said to no one in the room. Said to the dark and the snow and the wind off the harbor. Said because gratitude, once it breaks through, demands to be spoken even when there's no one left to hear it. Outside, the tide rose slowly against the harbor stones. The footprints of their march faded beneath the water. And on the third morning, when the medics brought real bread that cracked under the fingers and smelled of yeast and smoke, Erica turned to Lizelle and said, "Do you think they are mocking us?" Lizelle shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "I think they are simply done with hate." But what none of them knew yet was what would happen when the Americans left. What would happen when the kindness walked out the door and the cold returned? What would happen when Lizelle eventually crossed back into Germany and discovered what waited for her in the ruins of Hamburg? And what none of them could have imagined, not Lizelle, not Erica, not Louis from Ohio, was that what began in that warehouse on a January night in 1945 would not end in Le Havre, that it would travel, that it would survive decades and oceans and the long silence that falls over the things people are too ashamed to remember, that a blanket given to an enemy would one day be placed inside a glass case in a museum, that a letter would cross the Atlantic 30 years later with 5 words, "I never forgot that winter." What Lizelle carried out of that warehouse was not just warmth. It was a truth that would take her the rest of her life to fully speak. A truth about what human beings are capable of, not in their greatness, not in their heroism, not in their finest military hours, but in their quietest ones. When no one is watching. When the war has already been decided. When the only witness is a woman on her knees in the mud, waiting for the blow that never comes. In part 2, we will follow Lizelle through the journey inland, into the holding camps, the Red Cross stations, and finally back across the German border into the ruins of everything she once called home. And we will ask the question she spent the rest of her life trying to answer. What do you do with a kindness you were never supposed to receive? The answer will change everything you think you know about what it means to survive a war. In part 1, we met Laisel, a 22-year-old bakery clerk from Hamburg who became a German prisoner of war in January 1945. She and 39 other women arrived at a transit camp in Le Havre expecting punishment. Instead, American medics gave them blankets, hot food, and something far more disorienting than any interrogation could have been: dignity. But the Americans were preparing to move out, and what waited for Lizelle on the other side of their departure was a question that would take decades to answer. What do you do with kindness given by the enemy? And here is where the story gets harder. Because surviving the war was one thing, surviving what came after was something else entirely. The morning the Americans left, the temperature dropped 4 degrees. It was not a coincidence of weather. It simply felt that way. The French officers who replaced Louis and his unit were not cruel men. They were exhausted, bureaucratic, and utterly indifferent, which in its own way was worse than cruelty. Cruelty at least acknowledges your existence. Indifference erases it. Within 48 hours of the handover, the small stoves had gone cold. The radio had been removed. The warm water basins were gone. The women were processed with the mechanical efficiency of a system that had 40,000 prisoners to manage across 3 countries and no particular interest in the emotional condition of any of them. A French lieutenant named Beaumont conducted the first formal inspection. He moved through the warehouse with a clipboard, reading names in an accent that made the German words sound like accusations. When he reached Laisselle, he paused. "You were an auxiliary?" he asked through Renee, who had stayed on as interpreter. "A clerk," she said. "I wrapped bread." Beaumont looked at her for a moment, then made a mark on his clipboard and moved on. That was the entire conversation. That was the sum total of interest the new administration had in who she was or what she had experienced. She was a number in a ledger. Category: female prisoner, non-combatant. Destination: inland holding facility, pending repatriation assessment. The word repatriation sounded like a door opening. But no one told them how far away that door was. Erica, standing beside her, whispered, "How long?" Renee answered quietly, "Weeks. Maybe months. The system is overwhelmed. 11 million displaced persons across Europe. The Red Cross is processing as fast as they can. 11 million. The number landed in the room and stayed there. Outside, the last American truck disappeared around the harbor bend. Laisselle watched until the dust settled. For a long moment, she simply stood at the warehouse door, the army blanket still around her shoulders, watching the empty road. Then she turned back inside, because there was nowhere else to go. The weeks that followed were not brutal, they were gray. Gray food, gray sky, gray routines. Morning roll call, midday distribution of rations. Bread, weak broth, occasionally canned vegetables that smelled of tin and old water. Afternoon work details, sweeping, carrying, washing. Evening return to the warehouse. The women created structure because structure was the only thing that held them together. They organized themselves by former profession. The nurses tended anyone who fell sick. The teachers held informal language sessions, teaching fragments of French and English to anyone who wanted to learn. Laisselle taught the younger women to fold the army blankets with military precision, because Louis had shown her once, and the memory of his hands felt worth preserving. She also began to write. She had no paper at first. She used the margins of a discarded French newspaper. Then Renee, who visited twice a week to facilitate communications, brought her a small notebook. "You should record it," he said simply. "What happened here? The way it happened. Who would want to read it?" "No one now," he said. "But later, someone will." She wrote without planning to write anything important. She wrote the way people talk to themselves when they need to hear their own voice. She wrote about the blanket, about the medic's trembling hands, about the kettle whistling, about Erica's face when she tasted real bread for the first time in months. She wrote about the storm, about Louis's hand on her shoulder when thunder sounded like bombs and her body forgot the difference. She wrote about the radio, the slow American ballad, the way music entered through the chest before it reached the mind. She did not write about Germany, not yet. That part was still too large to approach directly. It was like trying to describe the sun by staring at it. At the 6-week mark, the French administration announced transport inland. 40 women, 2 military trucks, a journey of approximately 4 hours through the French countryside. The women packed what little they had. Most of them had nothing except the clothes on their backs and whatever small items the Americans had left behind. A bar of soap, a tin cup, a scrap of paper with a word of English written carefully in pencil. Laisselle packed her notebook, and she packed the blanket. Erica watched her fold it into her bag. "You're keeping it?" "It goes where I go." The truck ride inland was silent and devastating in its beauty. France in late winter was beginning to show the first stubborn signs of recovery. Fields that had been tank tracks and shell craters were starting to close over with frozen mud. In one village they passed through, a woman was hanging laundry. White sheets on a line, moving in the wind. Laisselle watched until the village disappeared behind a hill and then looked at her hands in her lap and thought, somewhere, someone is doing something ordinary. The world did not stop. The inland camp was smaller and colder than Le Havre, but drier. Wooden barracks. A central courtyard. A perimeter fence that was less about security and more about geography. There was nowhere nearby to run to, and no one was running. The women assigned to Laysel's barracks arranged their bunks with the same instinctive organization they had developed in the warehouse. Nurses near the door. Older women near the stove. Laysel near the window, because she wanted to see the sky. The Red Cross arrived in March. 2 representatives, one Swiss, one British, moving through the camp with forms and gentle efficiency. They recorded names, assessed health, documented prior residence, and began the long administrative process of determining who could go where and when. Germany in early 1945 was not a place receiving people with open infrastructure. Cities were rubble. Rail lines were destroyed. Food distribution had collapsed. Returning someone to Hamburg meant returning them to a city where 43,000 people had died in a single week of firebombing in 1943, and where what remained was being administered by whoever had survived long enough to claim the title. The British representative, a woman named Margaret, sat across from Laysel in the assessment room. She asked the standard questions in careful German. Name, age, pre-war address, occupation, health status, family contacts still living. On that last question, Laysel paused. My father, she said. I don't know. Your mother? Hamburg. 1943. Margaret wrote something down and did not ask further. She had heard this answer, or a version of it, approximately 200 times in the past 3 weeks. She looked up. You speak some English? A little. I learned in the camp. Which camp? Le Havre. The Americans were there. They were... She stopped. She tried to find the word. Kind, she finally said. Margaret looked at her for a moment, then at the notebook visible at the edge of Laysel's bag. Is that yours? Yes. You wrote in it? About the camp. About what happened there. Margaret closed her folder. May I? Laysel hesitated, then handed it over. The British woman read for approximately 4 minutes without speaking. Then she handed it back, carefully, with both hands, as if it were something fragile. She said, You should keep writing. That was all. But the way she said it was not a casual suggestion. It was the voice of someone who recognized that what she had just read was a document, not in the bureaucratic sense, but in the deeper sense. Evidence. Proof that something had happened that the official record would not capture, and that the human record could not afford to lose. In April, Laysel's name appeared on a repatriation list. Hamburg, via Red Cross transit through Cologne. Departure in 10 days. She read the notice 3 times, standing in the courtyard in the thin spring sunlight, and felt nothing she expected to feel. Not relief, not joy. Something more complicated. The specific weight of an ending that reveals how much you weren't prepared for a beginning. Erica found her standing there. You're on the list? Yes, me too. Erica looked toward the gate. I keep trying to imagine what it looks like now. Hamburg, Germany. Laysel was quiet for a moment. I think it looks like us. They stood in the courtyard until the bell rang for evening rations. Around them, spring was doing what spring does in the ruins of terrible winters. Arriving anyway, without permission, without apology, pushing green through cracked concrete and blackened earth, because that is simply what life does when the killing stops. On the night before departure, Laysel sat in her bunk and opened the notebook. She had filled most of it. She turned to the last blank page and wrote one final entry. Not about what had happened, about what she was carrying home. I am bringing back a blanket that was given to me by a man who had every reason not to give it. I am bringing back the memory of his hands. I am bringing back the knowledge that it is possible, not easy, not painless, but possible, to choose mercy in the middle of destruction. I do not know what Germany looks like now. I do not know if my father is alive. I do not know what it means to go home to a place that may no longer exist. But I know what those men did in that warehouse, and I know what it meant, and I will not let it disappear. She closed the notebook. She folded the blanket one more time. Outside, the spring rain began to fall, soft and indifferent and necessary. But what Laysel did not yet know, what none of the women on that repatriation list had been told, was that the Germany they were returning to had changed in ways that went far beyond rubble and silence. Something had been discovered. Something that would force every surviving German to confront not just the question of what had been done in their name, but the question of who they had been while it was being done. The files were opening, the camps were being filmed, the names were being written down, and for a woman carrying a notebook full of American kindness, walking back into a country drowning in the evidence of its own crimes, the hardest question was still ahead. Not did they hurt us, but what did we allow? In part 1, Laezel knelt in the mud of Le Havre and received a blanket from an enemy soldier. In part 2, she survived the gray machinery of post-war processing, the French officers, the Red Cross forms, the inland camps, and began writing down everything she could remember before memory softened the edges. She was placed on a repatriation list. She was going home. But the cliffhanger we left you with was this. The Germany she was returning to had been cracked open. The camps had been filmed, the files were being read, and a woman carrying a notebook full of American kindness was walking back into a country that was only beginning to understand what it had done. Now the story shifts, because surviving the war was the first chapter. What survival demands of you? That is the harder one. Spring 1945 in Germany was not a season. It was an exposure. Every retreating front had peeled back another layer of what the Reich had constructed beneath its speeches and its flags. By the time Laezel's transport crossed the German border in April, the liberation of concentration camps was already international news. Buchenwald had been opened in April 11th. Bergen-Belsen on the 15th. Dachau on the 29th. American soldiers had photographed everything, filmed everything. Eisenhower had ordered documentation with deliberate, systematic thoroughness because he understood, with the clarity of a man who had seen the camps himself and nearly wept, that someday someone would claim this had not happened. The numbers were staggering and still are. Approximately 6 million Jewish victims. 11 million total dead in the camp system. Thousands of German civilians were marched through the gates of nearby camps by Allied commanders and forced to look at what had been built within walking distance of their homes. Laezel did not need to be marched anywhere. The knowledge arrived through the windows of the transport truck in fragments. Overheard conversations. A Red Cross pamphlet pressed into her hands at a checkpoint. The face of a French guard who looked at the German women on the truck with an expression she had never seen before and could not yet name. It was not hatred. It was something colder. The specific look of a person confronting evidence that exceeds the capacity of hatred to explain it. She read the pamphlet in the back of the truck, her blanket across her knees, her notebook in her bag. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it between the pages of the notebook, because even this, especially this, was part of what needed to be remembered. Erica sat beside her. "Did you know?" she asked quietly. Laezel took a long time to answer. "I knew something," she said finally. "I don't know if that's the same thing." The truck moved through a village where a woman was sweeping the steps of a church. The woman did not look up as they passed. Germany in April 1945 had learned the specific skill of not looking up, of keeping the eyes at the level of the immediate task, the swept step, the mended fence, the pot of water coming to boil. Because looking up meant seeing the horizon, and the horizon was full of things no one was prepared to account for. Hamburg appeared in the late afternoon light, like a wound that had stopped bleeding but not closed. Laezel had grown up in a city of 1.7 million people, a port city of red brick and wide water, of fish markets and church spires, and the particular smell of the Elbe at low tide. What remained in April 1945 was approximately 40% of that city. The Operation Gomorrah firebombing raids of July 1943 had killed between 34,000 and 43,000 people in 10 days. The largest firestorm ever created by conventional bombing in the history of warfare. Entire neighborhoods had burned so completely that the rubble had fused into a single continuous layer. Streets existed as names on maps that no longer corresponded to anything physical. She found her street, or rather, she found the space where her street had been. The bakery below her family's apartment was a foundation outline in blackened brick. The building above it was gone. She stood on the edge of the foundation for a long time, the blanket over her arm, the notebook in her hand, and did something she had not done since the warehouse in Le Havre. She allowed herself to feel the full weight of it without trying to manage it. The loss of the building, the loss of her mother, the likely loss of her father, the loss of the specific, ordinary life that had existed in those rooms. Bread smell in the morning, the sound of the radio, the particular creak of the third step on the staircase. She let it arrive, all of it at once, Then she turned away from the foundation and walked toward the neighbor's door she already knew, because survival requires continuation, and she had survived this far by keeping her feet moving forward. Frau Metzger opened the door. "My God," she whispered. "You're alive." She was given an attic room, a cot, a bowl of thin soup. That night, under the American blanket, in the ruins of the city she had grown up in, Laisel opened her notebook to a blank page and wrote without stopping for 2 hours. She wrote about the camps, about the pamphlet, about Erica's question in the truck, about what it meant to have received kindness from men whose nation had just opened the doors of Buchenwald and Dachau and photographed what was inside, and to carry both of those things simultaneously, the blanket and the knowledge, without collapsing under the contradiction. She did not resolve the contradiction that night. She would not resolve it for years. But she wrote it down with complete honesty, because Renee had told her to record what happened, and what was happening now was the hardest part. The following weeks were a study in the specific texture of collective shame. Hamburg in summer 1945 was beginning the long administrative process of denazification, the Allied program that required former party members to complete questionnaires, attend hearings, and submit to classifications ranging from major offenders to followers to exonerated. The process was simultaneously necessary and insufficient, like trying to drain an ocean with a bucket while acknowledging that the ocean was, in fact, still there. Liesel watched her neighbors navigate the questionnaires with the same careful skill they had applied to not looking up. Answers calibrated precisely to the minimum admission required. Memories managed. Contexts supplied. She understood the impulse. She shared it in the specific way that everyone who had lived through those years shared the deep human need to believe that their individual participation had been peripheral, incidental, fundamentally different from the thing itself. But she had a notebook, and the notebook made selective memory impossible. She found her father in September. He had survived the firebombing by being out of the city on a delivery run. He returned to find his home gone and had spent the intervening 2 years in a temporary settlement 20 kilometers north, working as a laborer on a farm owned by a family whose son had not come back from the Eastern Front. He was thinner. His hands were rougher. He had the same eyes. When she showed him the notebook, he read it without speaking for a very long time. When he finished, he placed it on the table between them and put his hand over hers. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the gesture did not already contain. She began teaching in the autumn of 1946. The school had been established in a building that had not what did the soldiers do, not what did the prisoners feel, but what does it mean, decades later, when the people who lived it are gone and only the objects remain? What does a blanket in a glass case teach a child who was born 60 years after the war ended? And what does it mean that the answer to that question, the last, quiet answer, was written not by a general or a historian, but by a woman who once wrapped bread in paper and said good morning to the same customers every single day? Across 3 parts, we have followed Liesel from the mud of Le Havre to the ruins of Hamburg. We watched her receive a blanket from an enemy's hands. We watched her survive the gray machinery of post-war processing, cross back into a broken country, and begin the long, impossible work of teaching children how to hold contradictions without being destroyed by them. In part 3, we left her sitting in an empty classroom with a worn army blanket on the corner of her desk and a boy named Heinrich walking out the door into the autumn light. The cliffhanger was this: what does it mean when the people who lived the story are gone and only the objects remain? Now, in this final chapter, we answer that question. But first, there is one detail about this story that almost no one knows, and it changes everything. Laisel taught school in Hamburg for 31 years. She never married. She never left the city. She lived in the same attic room where Frau Metzger had given her a cot in 1945, and when Frau Metzger died in 1962, Liesel quietly took over the lease and stayed. The room was small. The window faced north, toward the harbor. On clear days, she could see the cranes of the rebuilt port, taller and cleaner than the ones that had existed before the war. She found a particular comfort in watching them. The evidence that things destroyed could be rebuilt, not identically, not without visible seams, but genuinely, functionally, tall enough to be useful again. She kept the blanket in a cedar chest beneath her bed. Every year, on the first day of winter, she took it out. She unfolded it slowly, the way you unfold something you want to last, and she sat with it in her lap by the window and allowed herself 1 full hour of memory. The medic's hands, the kettle whistling, Louis saying "welcome" with the wrong German word, in completely the right tone. Erica's face in the truck. Her father's hand over hers on the table. 1 hour. Then she folded it back and returned it to the chest and went about her day. This was not avoidance, it was discipline. The discipline of someone who understands that memory, handled carelessly, becomes either sentimentality or trauma, and that the distance between those two failures is maintained only by the deliberate choice to engage on your own terms. She continued writing. The original notebook was filled by 1947. She began a second, then a third. By the time she retired from teaching in 1978, she had filled 11 notebooks with the accumulated testimony of a life lived at the intersection of history's worst impulse and its quiet best. She never attempted to publish them. She showed them to almost no one. The act of writing was sufficient unto itself. The recording, the preservation, the refusal to let the specific gravity of ordinary moments dissolve into the general blur of historical narrative. Her former students remembered her with the specific warmth that people reserve for teachers who told them the truth. Not the comfortable version, the actual version. Several of them became teachers themselves. One, a man named Klaus, who had sat in the third row and rarely spoke, became a historian at the University of Hamburg and spent his career documenting civilian experiences of the war's final months. He dedicated his first book to her. The dedication read, "For the teacher who showed me that history happens to people, not just to nations." She received no medals, no official recognition. The German government's process of denazification and national reckoning had no particular category for women who had received American blankets and written about it honestly. She was not a hero in any registerable sense. She was something less dramatic and more durable, a witness who refused to stop witnessing. When the letter arrived from Ohio in the late 1970s, it came through a chain of redirections that itself constituted a minor miracle of archival persistence. A man had contacted the German Red Cross, which had contacted a Hamburg municipal office, which had forwarded the inquiry to a former colleague of Liesel's at the school, who had walked it up 3 flights of stairs to her apartment door on a Tuesday afternoon in November. The envelope was plain. American stamp. The handwriting was old, but steady. Inside, a single paragraph. "I found your name in the Red Cross archive. I was one of the medics at Le Havre. Survived the bombing with most of its walls intact and none of its windows. The children sat in their coats in rooms heated by a single stove. They were the children of the war, born between 1935 and 1940, old enough to remember the flags and the speeches and the certainty, young enough to grow into something different if someone gave them the right material to work with." Liesel gave them her notebook. Not literally, but she gave them what was in it. She told them about Le Havre, about the blanket, about Louis from Ohio with his trembling hands and his broken German. She told them with complete honesty, which meant she also told them about the camps, about the questionnaires, about her neighbor who swept her steps and did not look up, about Erica asking "did you know" in the back of a truck, and the long pause before any answer was possible. She told them the truth was not one thing. It was a blanket and a pamphlet at the same time. It was a man giving you warmth in January, and those same hands having fired at people in Normandy. It was receiving kindness from an army that had opened the doors at Dachau. History did not resolve into clean lessons. It held contradictions the way a person holds grief, not by resolving it, but by carrying it forward and refusing to put it down. One child, a boy named Heinrich, sat in the front row with his fists clenched. Every class. The same posture, tight, defended, already building the walls he had inherited from the world that made him. She recognized him immediately because she had been him. She taught toward him specifically, without making it obvious, the way good teachers always do. In her 3rd year of teaching, Heinrich stayed after class. He was 12 years old, thin, with the kind of careful eyes that come from learning early that the world is not safe. He said, "My father says the Americans were hypocrites, that they talked about freedom while they had their own problem at home." Liesel sat on the edge of her desk. "He's right," she said. Heinrich blinked. "Then why do you tell the story like they were good?" "I don't tell it like they were good," she said. "I tell it like they made a choice." One night, in one warehouse, with 39 cold women in front of them, they chose one thing over another. That choice existed. It was real. It doesn't cancel the rest of what they were, and it doesn't cancel what we were. Both things happened. Heinrich was quiet for a moment. That's more complicated than what my father says. Yes, she said. It is. He left. She sat in the empty classroom for a while, with the blanket folded on the corner of her desk, watching the autumn light move across the floor. That conversation would stay with her for 50 years. Because it contained the thing she had been circling since the truck crossed the German border in April 1945. The understanding that the story of the blanket was not a story about good people and bad people. It was a story about what human beings choose to do in specific moments, with specific other human beings in front of them, inside systems that are pushing them towards something different. Lewis had been inside a system built for war. He had chosen, in one warehouse, on one night, to do something the system did not require. Lae'zel had been inside a system built for ideology. She had gone along in the specific way that most people go along, not with enthusiasm, but with the passive compliance that systems depend on to function. Both things were true. Both things mattered. She wrote the final entry in her original notebook that winter, sitting by the attic window with a candle and the faint sound of Hamburg beginning, slowly, stubbornly, imperfectly, to rebuild itself outside. The hardest question is not what they did to us. The hardest question is what we allowed. And the only honest answer is, we allowed more than we admitted and less than the worst. We were ordinary people inside an extraordinary crime. And the men who gave us blankets were ordinary people capable of extraordinary mercy. The distance between those two ordinary states is where all of history lives. She closed the notebook. She folded the blanket. She went to sleep. But what Lae'zel could not have known, lying in that attic room in 1946, 30 years before the letter from Ohio would arrive, was that her notebook was not finished. That a young woman named Sophia would one day read it. That a museum in Hamburg would one day build an exhibit around a single piece of worn army wool. That on the first day of every winter, someone would place a folded blanket at the foot of a tree planted in her honor, and no one would ever know who. There is one final chapter to this story, the one that answers the question no one thought to ask at the time. Havre, winter 1945. I never forgot that winter. I hope you are well. His name was Thomas Lewis. Sergeant, United States Army, 29th Infantry Division. He was 71 years old and living in a veterans home outside Columbus, Ohio. Lae'zel sat with the letter for a long time. Then she opened her 12th notebook and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. She wrote, "He remembered." Then she wrote nothing else for the rest of that day, because those two words contained everything that needed to be said, and she understood that anything added would only diminish them. She wrote back. A careful letter, 4 pages, translated into English with the help of a dictionary and the fragments she had accumulated over 30 years of occasional practice. She told him about the classroom, about Heinrich, about the boy who became a historian, about the cedar chest and the annual hour by the window. She told him that she had kept the blanket and why. She told him that she had taught the story of that night to hundreds of children over 3 decades, and that she believed, without sentimentality, but with genuine conviction, that some of those children had made different choices at different moments because of what they had heard in that cold Hamburg classroom. She did not know if he received the letter. He died in the spring of 1979, before any reply could have arrived. A nurse at the veterans home, a woman named Patricia, later wrote to the Red Cross contact to inform them. She mentioned that the photograph had been on his windowsill, the one she did not specify but clearly meant, the one that had arrived in a package forwarded through a museum, a university, and a family whose name nobody recognized anymore. He had kept something too. That detail. The symmetry of it. 2 people on opposite sides of an ocean, keeping evidence of the same night in separate rooms for 35 years, is the detail that most people do not know. It did not appear in any history book. It was not in any official record. It existed in the margin between what history documents and what human beings actually carry, which is where most of the important material lives. Lae'zel died in 1998, on a morning in late winter, seated in her armchair with the blanket across her knees and a cold cup of tea on the table. The slip of paper beside her said 3 words in German. I remember. Whether those words were directed at Lewis, at the medics, at her students, at history itself, or simply at the specific weight of a January night in 1945, no one could say. Perhaps all of those at once. Perhaps that is what remembering finally becomes when you have done it honestly for 50 years. Sophia, the former student who carried the blanket to the funeral and organized the museum exhibit, spent 18 months documenting the full story. The exhibit opened in Hamburg in 2001. In the center of the display case, the blanket. Beside it, the 12 notebooks, preserved under glass. Beside those, a single photograph. Not of Lazel, and not of Louis, but of the warehouse at Le Havre as it had looked in January 1945. Gray and broken and ordinary, with the sea just visible through a gap in the damaged wall. The exhibit received no major press coverage. It was not a landmark institution. It occupied a room in a small history museum that also displayed artifacts from the Hamburg firebombing and the Reconstruction period. School groups visited on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Tourists found it occasionally, usually by accident, usually on the way to somewhere else. But the guest book filled steadily. Page after page of handwriting in a dozen languages. A German woman who had been a child in Hamburg during the bombing and had never spoken to anyone about what she saw. A Japanese student who had come to Europe to study post-war reconciliation and wrote 3 pages in careful English about what the blanket meant to her. An American veteran of a later war who stood in front of the case for 45 minutes and wrote only, "We tried." A French schoolteacher who brought her class every year because, she wrote, "This is the only exhibit I have found that tells the truth about all of us." The plaque beside the cedar tree outside reads, Lazel, 1922 to 1998. She returned with nothing, but carried home a warmth that still lives. Each year on the first day of winter, someone places a folded wool blanket at the foot of the tree. The museum staff have never identified who does it. The blanket is always plain. Army weight. The kind that scratches against cold skin and holds heat longer than it has any right to. This is what Lazel's story teaches, gathered across 76 years and 4,000 kilometers, and 12 notebooks and 1 cedar chest. It is not a lesson about war, though it lives inside one. It is not a lesson about nations, though it crosses several. It is a lesson about the specific moment when a human being, inside a system designed to produce one outcome, chooses to produce a different one. Louis did not save the world that night. He gave one woman a blanket. One woman who then gave 30 years of honest testimony to hundreds of children, one of whom became a historian, several of whom became teachers, all of whom carried something forward that they could not have carried if she had not first decided to write it down. That is how the moral inheritance of small acts actually works. Not in dramatic cascades, in quiet transmissions, teacher to student, letter to archive, blanket to chest, notebook to glass case, hand to hand, winter after winter, until the original moment is so far behind you that you can only see it by the light it left. The world has had no shortage of moments like Le Havre, moments where someone had every justification to strike and chose instead to shelter. Moments that happened in a dark room with no witnesses except the people inside it. Most of those moments vanished. The people who lived them were too busy surviving to write anything down, or too ashamed of the broader context to claim the smaller mercy inside it, or simply too ordinary to imagine that what they had experienced was worth preserving. Lazel was also ordinary. That is exactly the point. She was a bakery clerk, who became a prisoner, who became a teacher, who became, entirely without intending to, a historian of the thing that saved her. She did not think she was doing anything important. She thought she was simply trying to remember honestly in a world that was working very hard to forget selectively, and she was right about that. And the remembering mattered. And the blanket is still there, behind glass, in a small museum in Hamburg, on a street that did not exist before 1945, because the one that was there before was destroyed and rebuilt, which is what streets do when they survive the thing that was supposed to erase them. From a warehouse in Le Havre, where 39 women knelt in the mud expecting punishment, to 12 notebooks, a cedar chest, a museum exhibit, and a blanket placed at the foot of a tree every first day of winter by someone who leaves no name. That is the full distance this story traveled. That is what one act of unrequired mercy produced across half a century. The greatest truth this story carries is also its quietest. It was never about the war. It was about the moment inside the war when the war stopped being the loudest thing in the room. When a man's trembling hands placing wool on cold shoulders became briefly the only thing that mattered. And it turns out that moment, that specific, unremarkable, unwitnessed, undocumented, profoundly ordinary moment, was the one worth keeping. Everything we carry from the darkest winters began as something someone chose to give.